morning. I am Jennifer Esposito with the Pennsylvania Family Support Team based at the Center for Schools and Communities. I'll be the moderator for today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar session, Building on Strength, Expanded Definitions of the Research Support for Strengthening Families' Protective Factors. And then I would like to introduce our presenter today, which is Rigel Kraft. I think you all may know her. Rigel Kraft serves as the Family Support Managing Coordinator at the Center for Schools and Communities, providing implementation support for Children's Trust Fund grantees and parents as teachers affiliates. Rigel develops and delivers professional development in strength-based family support practices and is a certified instructor for bringing the protective factors framework to life in your work, the Be Strong Parent Cafe model, and the Healthy Outcomes for Positive Experience or HOPE framework. Rigel holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Mansfield University, a master's degree in social justice from the School for International Training, a master's degree in nonprofit management from Eastern University, and is a graduate of the Pennsylvania Educational Policy Fellowship. Rigel lives in York, Pennsylvania with her partner and a menagerie of rescue pets. And it is my pleasure to welcome Rigel this morning. Rigel, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited that you're here. We are going to be talking today about some expanded definitions of the strengthening families protective factors. And I'm really excited that you're here. Before we get started, I want to launch a quick poll. I'm curious to hear how familiar you are with the strengthening families protective factors framework. If you're just learning about the protective factors, if you know some information, but I'm still learning, that you use them in your protective factors, or you use your protective factors in your work regularly, or you're a professional. Maybe you could be teaching this course, because I know some of you on this call could be. So feel free to fill that out. That's just going to help me a little bit in how much explanation I do along with these expanded definitions. So it does look like a lot of you, the bulk of you have heard about them, you know some information, or you're using them regularly. So we'll go ahead and give another maybe second or so, and then we can close that poll and show the results. So yeah, so most people are feeling pretty comfortable with the protective factors. That's good to know. And it's okay if you're newer to the protective factors. There will be information for everyone in this webinar. So I want to start off with a little bit of background. And I do want to stress that I'm talking about these expanded definitions and updated research that's been added to the protective factors approach and the strengthening families approach. But this is not an overhaul or an upending or there's a new protective factor that's replacing. Like it's not that. In fact, you are going to see that a lot of the concepts are similar, but they have been elaborated upon. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And what I'm encouraging you to do are two things. One, listen with a curious mind and think about how these updates might impact the way you work with families, the way you talk about the protective factors with families, and how this protective factors framework might continue to be a frame that you use to guide program implementation, but also maybe advocacy or your community partnerships. But it isn't like a big, again, upending, right? A lot of these concepts are gonna sound very familiar. So a little bit of history, if you will. So one of the things that we're doing is thinking about how this strengthening families protective factors framework and approach that was developed in 2003 by the Center for the Study of Social Policy, how it has kind of evolved over time. And there are some important sort of milestones, if you will, along the way. So the protective factors framework was developed in part because folks were thinking about what are the things that are present in families that despite adversity, the families are still thriving, which I love because what a cool question. So many research questions start with a problem, right? And instead of starting with a problem, they thought, we know that some families thrive even when things are really difficult. What's there? What are those special ingredients in that family? What are those characteristics that help them thrive? And that's where the Strengthening Families work started. And CSSP worked with some other national organizations. You hear us talk a lot about the Children's Trust Fund Alliance, as well as Be Strong Families, for those of you that are familiar with protective factors, to really uh, elaborate on this approach, this strengths-based approach, and looking at these 5 protective factors that research and conversations with families and practitioners bubbled up as those characteristics that help to keep families strong and children safe. So in 2011, there was when this work started, it was really in early childhood, and thinking about the youngest kiddos, the families with the youngest kiddos, and in part because most instances of child abuse and neglect occur 0 to 5. So they were sort of concentrating in this time frame. They realized that parents continue to be important in children's lives as they get older, but that at some point, children start to make decisions that impact their own development. And as a result, they created the Youth Thrive Protective and Promotive Factors Framework. We are not going to talk about Youth Thrive today because it's like a whole nother thing that's really interesting, and I encourage you to check it out. But we're not going to focus on that today. But the Youth Thrive Framework is basically the same protective factors, but how do they show up in the lives of young people? So these are complementary frameworks. Strengthening Families, prenatal through about age 8, Youth Thrive 9 through about 26. And they look at how these 5 protective factors really show up in the lives of parents and children, to help them thrive and develop well. So in 2014, CSSP released Branching Out and Reaching Deeper, which some of you may have read. It's a research brief about the research behind strengthening families, and it really established some of the guiding principles of strengthening families and Youth Thrive, and it really added to the research. So 10 years, almost 10 years went by, and we had, a life-altering event for many people, the pandemic, and there was an opportunity to update this research. Lots of research had happened between 2014 and 2023, that not specifically necessarily about the protective factors, but bolstered the concepts behind the protective factors. So in 2023, CSSP decided to look at expanding these definitions. And to do that, they held listening sessions and they called their folks. They had parents, they had practitioners, they had researchers talk about the protective factors and how they show up in families' lives. They also looked at updated research, and in 2024, back in February of last year, they released Expanding the Perspectives and Research Foundation for the Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive Frameworks. Jen's going to put the link to that article in the chat, and I'll make sure that when we send out the acknowledgement of attendance, we'll put it there too. I am going to touch on concepts that are all in this research brief, but there's so much more than I'm going to have a chance to touch on today. It is a really great read. It's a little long, but it's super fascinating, and the research is really interesting. So I just wanted to kind of give that lay of the land, to talk about how we got here today. So I am going to go on, and we're going to talk about one of the foundational concepts that I think is very important as we get into this. And so, as you know, here are the protective factors: resilience, concrete support, knowledge of parenting and child development, social connections, and social and emotional competence of children. And the idea is that these protective factors, when present in an individual, family, or child, they are protective. They help us, they protect us from toxic stress. It doesn't necessarily mean that bad things don't happen in families that have protective factors, but parents that have protective factors for their families um, can mitigate the impact of stress when it occurs. Okay. So again, sort of back to that original question that they started this research with. What is it in families that, despite difficult circumstances, allow them to continue to thrive? And those are these protective factors that protect against stress. But it's also really important to think about these characteristics as being promotive in the sense that they actively promote well-being. So a great example of this is social connections. When you're having a really tough day, it is so important to be able to connect with someone about what happened and have that relationship that helps you sort of bounce back from a tough day. Maybe you're able to vent, you're able to get some support. But it's also really great to have friends, regardless of what's going on in your life. Having those connections is promotive in that even when things aren't difficult, they're actively promoting well-being. In the new research brief, there's a big section. We're not going to focus on it today, but there is a large section that talks about domains of well-being and how these protective factors not only, protect against the difficult things, but also actively promote multiple domains of well-being in families. Okay. So let's get into the rest of these foundational values. Now, what I am going to say about these foundational values is some of them are very similar to what you may have heard me say before as the big ideas between the or about the protective factors, but I do want to just touch on some ways that these foundational ideas have been expanded. So all along, the strengthening families approach has been considered a social ecological approach. Say that many times fast. And the idea of a social ecological approach is that it really goes beyond the individual, right? So there's the individual, but the individual has some responsibility in the way things happen, and certainly the way they interact with the world is important. But that idea of interacting with the world is part of the social ecological approach. I'm going to have a really hard time saying that this morning, apparently. So this idea includes environmental influences like their relationships between the individual and other folks, their relationships with their community, and with society as a whole. And when you take a look at this, it means that you're looking at the individual and how they show up in the world in a very holistic way and a comprehensive examination of conditions and processes that can either help to build protective factors or undermine protective factors. And traditionally, a lot of research around the protective factors is focused on the first two circles that I showed, the individual and the relational. It thinks about protective factors for an individual or protective factors for a family. But research has really begun to examine how institutional, community, and systemic or societal forces affect children, youth, parents, and families in tandem with their individual characteristics and how they relate to others. And not only that, not only does research show that there's an impact, but research also shows that when we intervene, when we or deliver programming, even prevention programming that impacts the community and societal level of the social ecological model, that those policy and practice interventions reduce risk and enhance the protection, and actually show some pretty promising evidence for prevention. So this is a really important concept in these foundational values. So this next foundational value is one that you've heard before. Employ a strengths-based approach. The Strengthening Families approach at its core is one that recognizes that folks have intrinsic value, and that they have assets or strengths that they can rely on to improve their well-being and help them thrive. It doesn't ignore risk, challenges, pain, or factors that perpetuate or create inequitable circumstances, but it does acknowledge that when there are difficulties in an individual's life, they can be framed as motivation or opportunities for positive change. So it's a more of a strengths-based rather than a deficit-based approach. So you often hear us say we focus on what's strong and not on what's wrong. So it is this also helps us to think about how we recognize and respond to oppression and privilege. Um, both of the frameworks, Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive, are about improving the lives of children, youth, and families. And you really cannot do that in our world without acknowledging systems and beliefs that oppress some and privilege others. And when you think about it, this is in part that different families have different experiences within the same systems. So acknowledging that our systems and our beliefs and the way we interact with folks can be different for different families. And so this helps us to recognize and then also respond to that. How can we consider what we might do to create systems, environments, experiences for families that help them thrive rather than being negative experiences. So thinking about that, it also helps us to consider an intersectional frame of reference. So some of you may have heard of an intersectional frame of reference related to identity. So we often talk about our identities are intersectional. So I am not only a white person, but I'm also a white woman. I am a white heterosexual woman. Those identities intersect and create privilege for me, and it can also create opportunities where there can be discrimination or oppression based on my identities, right? And that's for everyone. So the idea of intersectional identities is one thing. This goes a step further and helps and asks us to consider that it's not just that we have intersectional identities that might privilege us in some ways and not in others, but also that there are interlocking systems of power or inequity, and those interlocking systems can lead to oppressing some and privileging others. And so again, thinking about how can we create more equitable opportunities. An example of like an intersectional systems, I was thinking about this morning, and what immediately came to my mind is the idea of some of our benefit systems and the way our benefit systems interact. We have systems that require things like having a job or looking for a job, but that can sometimes but benefit cliffs are a real thing, right? And increases in income can sometimes create a benefit cliff for a family. So how do those systems work together either to support a family or make it more difficult for them to thrive? So that's this idea of intersectional frames of reference. So this approach also helps us to demonstrate cultural responsiveness, humility, and intellectual humility. So many of you have probably heard us talk about that culture is really important when we're considering this framework because our culture and a family's culture impacts the way they parent their children. one of my favorite definitions of parenting is that it's a series of cultural decisions in how to raise and socialize a child, and those decisions are impacted by the culture that we are a part of. So, being also the other side of that is that culture, because it informs all the things that we do, it's also an overarching protective factor, in the sense that it's a overarching protective factor that influences how resilience is demonstrated, the nature of social connections, what knowledge is acquired and how, the expression of social and emotional competence, and the type of concrete support and care that we seek and provide. So, culture itself is an overarching protective factor, and it's really influential. So we have to think about how we can be responsive to the cultures of the families that we serve, thinking about how we appreciate and value cultural differences, that we interact with families in a way that affirms their worth, and then that we have cultural humility, that we do an honest self-examination and self-reflection, a critical consciousness, if you will, about our own culture and what assumptions and beliefs we might bring to the work that we do. Um, Intellectual humility, I love that this is included. We hear a lot about cultural responsiveness and cultural humility, but this idea that we don't have all the answers, right? That we need to recognize that our current beliefs and the way we understand the world, they could be wrong, right? And we don't have all of the answers. So, being humble in that respect, and one of the things I hear from you all time and time again is that you learn as much from the families that you serve as you're imparting to them. And that's this concept that we have a lot, that we don't know everything, that our families know a lot, and that we're working together to make sure their families are healthy and thriving. So these last two are related, and these are much more at the forefront in these new protective factors definitions than what they have been in the past. And it's this idea of amplifying constituent voice and power, making sure that families and parents are involved in the work that we do, that they are that they inform every aspect of the work that we do, and that we're sharing power and decision making with the families that we serve. And that relates directly to pursuing a more equitable and just world that requires all individuals and populations be valued equally, that historical injustices are recognized and rectified, and that resources are provided according to need. That is those are the overarching values that have been expanded upon in this new framework. So I'm interested to hear from you. That was a lot of talking from me and a lot of, um, and my mouse fell asleep because I talked so long. Um, I'm interested to hear from you. What did you notice about the foundational values? Did you notice anything, any themes, any common themes that you saw? And you can go ahead and put those responses in the chat. If anyone wants to, they could open their mic and answer as well. It could take one or two out loud as well as chat. Did you notice? They continue to be the foundation of family support. Yeah, a lot of these concepts aren't new, right? They are what underpins the work that you do every day. Does it seem like there are a lot of things that individuals don't have much control of? A stronger incorporation of diversity concepts, everything is in relation to the environment plus the individual. I appreciated the intellectual humility piece. They're relevant across domains. Yeah, absolutely. All of these things that you're answering are definitely true. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I noticed when I read, and I actually saw the definitions before I read the research brief, was like there is a much bigger focus on it's not just about the individual and the families, that there are influences beyond what the individual and family can control that impact their ability to build or uh, impact their ability to build protective factors, or even can actively make it difficult for families to build protective factors. Okay, yep, there's lots of, and yeah, the comment about them being relevant across domains, great thought, and I would encourage everyone to check out that research brief because you're going to see, and I'm going to touch a little bit as we go through the definitions, but there are some great connectors to other frameworks like thinking about the domains of wellness from the CDC or thinking about social determinants of health. So there's a lot of like connecting pieces, I think, in these definitions as well. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to go through, thank you for answering that. We're going to go through and talk about the expanded definitions. See what I did there? Just like, okay. Um, all right, parental resilience. So before we get into this, I'd like for you all to put in the chat, what's a word you think of right now about parental resilience? Just go ahead and throw it in the chat. We're going to do this for every protective factor. So put in the chat a word that makes you think of parental resilience. Bouncing back. Strength, communication, great. Getting back up, stamina, strength, single parents, yeah, flexible, self-efficacy, strength, problem solving, asking for help, great, focus, determination, wonderful. Well, y'all can keep reading those, but we're going to go ahead and get right into these definitions. So the original definition that we've always used is managing stress and functioning well when faced with challenges, adversity, and trauma. Okay, now the new definition is not that different. All right, it's managing stress and functioning well, facilitated by individual, relational, community, or societal factors when faced with stressors, adversity, or trauma. So the difference here is what is between the dashes. And it really acknowledges the need to redefine resilience from an individual trait to something that is either encouraged by or hampered by our relationships, our community, and society. So most traditional understandings of resilience really place the locus of control within the individual. It's their sole responsibility to thrive despite adversity. And one of the thought partners, this is probably my favorite thing in the entire research brief. One of the thought partners in the conversations, and I'm going to read this quote directly. They said, "We can't just keep expecting parents and youth to be resilient, to overcome obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. At some point, we must not have so many obstacles." And that just sort of like stopped me in my tracks and was like, yes. Like, I'm not saying that being resilient and being able to bounce back from challenges is not a super positive thing. It absolutely is. But at what point are we like, we can't just expect people to continue to like just pull themselves up, get back up in the face of conditions that are actively sometimes not helping. So this is based on, so that, like, to me, that summed it all up. I was like, okay, I don't need to read anymore. However, there's some great research related to this. So, for example, societal factors that facilitate resilience are processes within social, political, economic, legal, health, and environmental systems that really support positive macro, so top outside, I guess, of the social ecological model, that support positive macro level change in response to macro level root causes of diversity. So on the micro level, on the individual and the relational side, there are characteristics, there are supports of friends and family members that can help to build resilience, right? And those are all great. But there are also things that we can do to impact systems and do advocacy around that can really help to change those macro level root causes of adversity. And one of the places where this research is occurring is in this idea of community protective factors, which I find like really fascinating. And that a preliminary study of community protective factors sort of named four conditions that are regarded as essential for children, youth, and families and communities to thrive. And they are, and listen to these, right? They're the protective factors, but on a macro level. Um, Providing equitable access to essential basic needs such as affordable and quality housing, fostering a collective understanding that asking for help is a sign of strength and that all parents and young people can benefit from support, promoting racial and social justice, and clarifying the community's collective responsibility and accountability for the well-being of children. So this study that was done was really focused on those four areas, and that those community protective factors, when in place, help to build the resilience of the community, but also the individuals in it. I did talk a little bit already about relational processes, because when the presence and emotional support that healthy, caring relationships have promote overall physical and mental health. So the relationships that folks have as a whole benefit. So that's like already like sort of bleeding into social connections, right? But those relationships actually help us to be resilient as well, because they can be protective against risk behaviors, adverse experiences, and the impact of trauma. Okay, so we talked about parental resilience. You put your words in the chat. I want you to go back to the chat now. What word would you add? Or maybe y'all know I'm not super strict about the one word policy. You could do like a little hashtag if you wanted, or a couple words. What would you add now that we just talked about this expanded definition? I see supported, I see equity, patient. Ooh, I like that. So a word or a couple words, like what's expanded in your idea about resilience, equality, support? Yeah. Trust the process. Collaboration. Yeah. Great. All right. Open-minded. Yeah. So flexible. Yeah. Thinking about how, we approach this definition might help you to think about how you talk about things with families, how you advocate for certain things. So keep that in mind as we move through, because now I'm going to ask you to do the same thing for social connections, right? So what's a word right now or a short phrase that you often use or think about when you are talking about this protective factor, social connections? Kara, I see you put supported again, right? Because absolutely. Yep, some more support, uplifting, healthy connection, friends, inner circle, trustworthy. Oh, group connections. All right. Shout out PAT. Relationships, friends, valuable, family and friends. Oh, self-care, important part. Parent cafes. Yeah. Great. Okay. All right. So great. Great start to what social connections are, quality relationships. Thank you, Lenora. Okay. So we have always talked about social connections, and y'all are picking up on it already, as positive relationships that provide emotional, informational, instrumental, and spiritual support. And then we've often defined, what does it mean to have an emotional connection or an informational connection or an instrumental or spiritual connection. Um, the new expanded definition is healthy, meaningful, trusting, and sustained relationships with people, institutions, communities, or a higher power that promote a sense of connectedness, belonging, and mattering. Okay. So I think all of us, can get behind the idea that social connections have lifelong positive effects. In fact, there's research out there that show that social connections positively support physical health, mental health, developmental, and overall well-being. For parents, social connections can relieve the stress of parenting, provide opportunities for concrete supports and resource sharing, and help with the development of resilience, like we just talked about, right? That relational resilience. And for anyone, having social connections during difficult times is particularly important because that's the protective nature of this protective factor. Um, what is interesting about this expanded definition, and again, we might be seeing a theme here, is that it's not just about interpersonal relationships. Those are absolutely key. Those person to person or person to group relationships, but it's also about institutional relationships. How do we interact with the institutions? How do we interact with the school? How do we interact with your home visiting program? How do we interact with the healthcare system? How do we interact with benefit systems, institutions, communities? How are we part of something bigger than ourselves or a higher power, which is again that idea of how do we feel connected to something bigger than us, right? Whether that be a community or a spiritual belief. It really calls that out in the main definition rather than sort of thinking about it as different types of connections. So, positive relationships with like what does that mean, having a positive relationship with an institution? Well, when you have let's take a school, for example. When you have a positive relationship with your child's school, you are more likely to be connected and involved. You might feel more like a partner in your child's education. You might be more willing to visit the school because you feel welcomed. You're more willing to consider how you partner with teachers to support your child's education. And it makes you, and you might even do things like get involved in the PTA or, do all those lovely fundraisers, that because you're part of something bigger and you want to support that institution. Um, Having an opportunity to be part of a community, right? That might be your neighborhood. It might be uh, like a trying to think of the name of it, but like the JCs or the Lions Club or the NAACP, like being connected to community in some way aligned, to your interests, or service opportunities. Or it could just be like your group of folks that all have kiddos around the same age, right? So being connected to those communities has a positive effect on the idea of belonging and self-worth. And spiritual connections or higher power helps to it has, I'm sorry, research has shown that having some kind of relationship with a higher power or a spiritual belief can uh, be really beneficial, especially when you're going through difficult times. The other thing I wanted to point out to this in this social connections definition are these three words. We just talked a lot about connectedness, but these other two words, belonging and mattering. So belonging is a feeling that you're an integral part of the surrounding system, including family, friends, school, work environments, community, and cultural groups. It means you feel welcome and included, and it has really positive impacts on emotions, a sense of self-worth, and physical and mental health. When you don't feel like you belong, it can actually contribute to negative outcomes or negative feelings of self-worth. There's also this piece that when you feel like you belong, you can show up as your authentic self. You can show up as you. We often use the phrase, we meet families where they are. And that's part of this, right? We want families to show up as their authentic selves because we're going to recognize their intrinsic value and make sure they feel like they belong. Mattering is similar, but it's this idea that others are aware and pay attention to the person. They care about what happened to me. They care, they value me. It's also about being able to add value, right? I can do something to support others, and I'm adding value to something that helps me to feel like I matter. And some studies have indicated that individuals who feel a persistent sense of mattering unconditionally to significant others have a key inner resource that fuels positive responses to life challenges. All right. So, um, I want to say one more thing about community connectedness. And there was a longitudinal study on happiness. And specifically, it found that individuals who are more connected to family, friends, school, and community are happier, healthier, and live longer than individuals who are disconnected. And that being connected helps to protect individuals from adverse effects of stressors and to delay mental and physical decline. So that makes me think that it's important for us as family support professionals to have intentional strategies that provide opportunities for families and children to feel connected and that they matter and belong. So, what word would you add to the chat now that you've heard this updated definition? Would you add a word or a phrase, something that stood out to you? I told you we're going to do this for every protective factor. And maybe it's the same word. And that's okay. Because like we said, this isn't an overhaul, right? This is an expansion. Perspective, not alone, community. Yeah, that idea of community. I think that's the thread that's running through this. Connectedness, connected, feeling valued, believe in self-worth, being open to new opportunities. Yeah, great. These are great. It's just it's like we're looking at it from a slightly different perspective. Okay, we're going to move on to knowledge of parenting and child development. So go ahead and put in the chat some words that you think of when you think of this protective factor. What do you think of when you think about knowledge of parenting and child development? Skills, knowledge of age-appropriate behaviors, awareness, learning, supportive, milestones, learning, past experience, yeah, screenings, open-mindedness, growth. I love that we're seeing that a lot of the same words come up for all of the protective factors because to me, that shows how interconnected they are. And often when you're building one protective factor, you're often building more than one. Loving and supportive information, ever changing. Yeah, right. We learn more and more about child development every day. The original definition was understanding child development and parenting strategies that support physical, cognitive, language, social, and emotional development. Our new definition is learning about prenatal infant and child development and using developmentally and contextually appropriate parenting practices. So I am a big fan of this new definition. And the very first part is the very first word. I love that we went from understanding to learning, right? Because I think someone said ever changing in the chat. We're learning, right? Kids don't come with a manual, and we're learning. And as science advances, as research advances, we're learning even more. So this is really a lifelong process to learn about parenting and child development. The definition also sort of calls out prenatal, which wasn't a focus in the first we talked about it, but it wasn't in the actual definition. It calls out the infant time frame as a very critical period of development. And it says out loud what some of you were saying in the chat, developmentally appropriate parenting practices and contextually appropriate parenting practices. And I want to start with that contextually appropriate because this goes back to our idea that culture is an overarching protective factor that influences everything that we do. Parenting can be considered a cultural act. a contextual act, and the context is the culture. Culture has a major influence on parents' beliefs, values, definitions, practices, the child behaviors they consider to be appropriate and inappropriate, and their acceptance of and responsiveness to parenting messages from their family, professionals, and the media. And it really, this approach really underscores the importance of highlighting, understanding, and honoring diverse parenting strengths, values, and expectations. That there are multiple pathways to competent parenting and promoting optimal child development. One of the things that's called out in the research brief is the concept of good enough parenting. And again, there was a thought partner who happened to be a trainer for strengthening families, who said, fully embracing the protective factor knowledge of parenting and child development means acknowledging that parenting is challenging at times, that no one can do it perfectly, and that children just need good enough parenting to allow them to develop their unique potential. And this concept of good enough parenting really prioritizes the quality of the parent-child relationship over any particular parenting practice, skill, and ideology. One of the trainers that I learned about protective factors from would say, look at the family dynamic. Does the child feel loved? They might not be doing the same parenting practices as what you think are appropriate, but is the child loved? Does the child feel loved? And that's what I always think of that when I hear the phrase good enough parenting. All right. This idea of it really does prioritize the parent-child interaction and the parent-child relationship. Any ideas that you'd like to put in the chat about knowledge of parenting and child development before we move on to concrete supports? Any new things you saw here? This one I think didn't change a lot, but there's a lot of new research around it. So is there anything that you might add or think about as you move forward with this protective factor? Like I said earlier, the key for me was this idea of learning. I really love this like sort of shift to this is really a lifelong process to learn about parenting and child development. Yeah, that learning versus understanding. Yep. All right. Well, I know we're moving through. I just want to make sure we get through everything. I was telling my colleagues this morning, this is only the third time I've done this, and I'm changing it up every time, and trying to figure out what is the most important things to say. Okay, so moving on to concrete support. So you are welcome to put in your ideas about concrete support into the chat, but we're going to go ahead and move right into these definitions to keep us on time. So the original definition, okay, first of all, actually, before I go into the definitions, this is the only protective factor that changed names. And it didn't change names, it just dropped off in times of need. It's now just concrete support, which I think most of us, that's what we called it anyway. But and there's a reason for that. Excuse me. So there's definitely more of the original definition was access to concrete support and services that address a family's needs and help minimize stress caused by challenges. And the expanded is identifying access, advocating for, and receiving high quality and equitable support, including the basic necessities everyone deserves and specialized services to address specific needs. And I think where the expanded definition really shines is this idea that there are some basic needs that everyone has, and those should be a given. Folks should have what they need. But there are also specialized needs that a family might have that are important to address as well. One of the really interesting pieces of this and the research that went into this expanded definition is how we advocate for and access those needs. One of the things, this is a place where you'll see a connection to the social determinants of health. It's not just about knowing where to go and advocating individually, it also, how can we think about how services are delivered, and societal level concerns regarding the provision of concrete support, particularly how it's related to those social determinants of health. The CDC defines social determinants of health as the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes, conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of daily life. So you might think about a social determinant of health like access or the lack thereof to nutritious food, safe and affordable housing, reliable transportation, stable neighborhoods, venues for physical activity and employment security, as well as discriminatory practices that are deeply embedded in various policies and practice. So, like Lenora put in the chat, immediate help. So concrete support is still about immediate health, but it's also looking at those systems and those policies that might be impacting a family's ability to access those needs. So, what does this mean for you? Well, it might impact, and I saw this earlier, I think, in resilience, how you collaborate in the community. How do you identify policies and systems that are working well for families and those that aren't? And what can you do to advocate as an agency, as individuals, to make those systems or those practices more equitable for families? That's one piece of it. There's also a piece in the research about collaborative goal setting, which I know a lot of you already do for families, but making sure that we are asking families what they need and what matters to them when we're setting goals. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to I'm sorry, no, we're on concrete supports, but social and emotional competence of children. So the original definition here was family and child interactions that help children develop the ability to communicate clearly, recognize and regulate their emotions, and establish and maintain relationships. The expanded definition really gets to the fact that this is about providing environments and experiences that are grounded in early relational health, that build positive social skills, enable children to regulate thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and promote effective communication, problem solving, and decision making skills. Now, we know that social and emotional development is the primary developmental task of early childhood because it impacts all other domains of development. And it's associated with academic, behavioral, and social outcomes. It really lays the foundation for later development. It doesn't happen naturally. Kids are not born with social and emotional skills. It happens through the interactions that occur between parents and children, and that's that early relational health. The idea of early relational health is how do parent and child relationships get stronger so that they can positively impact a child's development? These are the core life skills. Early childhood is a critical time for brain development because neural connections are established that become the foundation for the child's future health, learning, and behavior. So this expanded definition really helps us think about how do we provide environments and experiences, and how can we support parents to provide environments and experiences that that positively impact that early relational health. All right, we are running out of time, so I am going to summarize and wrap up, but I can stay a few minutes afterwards if you have any questions, but I want to get through the last couple minutes of our content so that everyone hears it, and then if anyone wants to stay and ask questions, I have some time that I can do that. Okay, so in summary, a very quick summary, so these expanded definitions are based in new research and conversations with parents, family members, practitioners, and researchers that have led to these expanded definitions. I'll have Jen put the link to the research brief in the chat one more time. Please take time to check it out. It's fascinating. You can tell I'm a bit of a research geek and I have a hard time limiting how much I say about the research. And there is an enhanced focus on the social ecological approach in the sense that many of the definitions are expanding our thinking about protective factors from the individual and relational locus of control into the community and societal level as well. And I'm hoping that this has encouraged you to consider how shifts in the definitions might impact your work and the way you talk about these protective factors with families. And on that note, I will say, I'll share one of my favorite quotes that education is not the filling of a pot. I feel like I did a lot of that today and a lot of talking, but the lighting of a fire. So I'm really hoping that thinking about these new protective factors has sparked your excitement about the work that you do, has sparked your interest and your curiosity about how you might incorporate these expanded definitions into your work. So I really appreciate your time today. I'll let Jen share about our upcoming webinars. And like I said, you're welcome to stay and I can answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Rigel. That was an amazing presentation packed full of lots of great information. Thank you all for joining us today. When you receive your electronic evaluation via email, please take a couple of minutes to complete it, as your feedback helps us to offer professional development of the highest quality. Registration information for next month's webinar has recently been emailed to you. I also just placed in the chat a link for registration as well. And you can see here our upcoming webinars, February 5th, and that's the link that's in the chat, Recipe for a Healthy Home Visit. And then the next one following that will be May 7th, Engaging Fathers and Male Caregivers. Thank you again for joining us, and that concludes today's webinar.
Thanks, everyone. We'll give about 5 minutes. You can put any questions you have in the chat. And if you have to hop off, totally understand. Really appreciate you being here today.